Hi class, and welcome back to another lecture for Psych 241, Social Psychology. Today we're going to touch on a very important topic, stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. And before we begin, I think it's important for me just to bring up a little about me, as mentioned before, but I am a straight white male with pretty much all the privileges that come with that. I grew up in a very, very white rural area in Ohio, and as I've mentioned before, there were not very many people of color or indigenous people around me. As such, I teach this from a very particular perspective, recognizing that while there have been scenarios that I have been stereotyped, this is not to the extreme that many people also have this happen to. So I do encourage people to look at this and reflect upon their own experiences in their own lives and to see where this comes from and where this is relevant to them, as it's very relevant for some people and for others a little less relevant. And I think that's important to mention before I really dig into this. But with that in mind, hopefully we can have a good discussion during our synchronous portion of the class regarding this. So with that in mind, today, the announcements, I really don't have anything other than my office hours, which everybody should know by now, and just a reminder to keep up with your assignments, make sure you're paying attention to that syllabus. Now, where are we going today? Well, first we're going to talk about the ABCs of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. We'll talk about where this stuff comes from, what are the consequences, and how we can reduce it. But let's start with the ABCs. And before we even begin with that, I had a VLQ for you. It's stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. These are three words that are often thrown around together or used in place of one another. Do they mean the same thing? Do you think A, yes, B, no, or C, no, but you often use them interchangeably? So go ahead and answer that and pause the video, and I will talk to you on the other side of that pause. All right, so with this, the correct answer, in my opinion, is that these are not the same thing. They each have a specific particular meaning, and oftentimes we will use them interchangeably on accident. I know I do this from time to time. But let's make sure we're very good about these definitions, right? Well, more or less, prejudice is this idea of an attitude. So prejudice is a hostile or negative attitude, right? ABCs of attitude, come back in here. This negative attitude towards people in a distinguishable group based solely on their membership of that group. Prejudice just means prejudging of another person, right? It's nothing too special about that, right? This is an attitude based on another person. And as we've already mentioned before, attitudes are just an evaluation of something. In this case, a person in a group. And think about what we mean by prejudice using this definition, a distinguishable group. This could be as little as somebody wearing a shirt for their football team, right? That is a prejudiced attitude towards somebody if you don't like the football team that they're wearing, and you say, as I have had, I remember being at a concert one time wearing an A&M shirt, and somebody just like, A&M sucks. I'm like, that's cool. I really don't care. But that was a prejudicial comment to me based on that definition. However, that's not normally what we talk about when we talk about prejudice. But let's apply the ABCs of attitude, affect, behavior, and cognition towards the theory of prejudice, right? So when we think about seeing somebody perhaps like this, there's a lot of things that come into our minds, right? We might have a specific feeling about this. We might think about whether we like or dislike this person. We can think about that as the affective component or the prejudicial component, right? This hostile or negative attitude. But then we can also talk about behavioral components of this. The behavioral component of this is the idea of discrimination, right? Unjustified negative actions. Actually taking an action toward a group member based solely on that membership, right? If somebody punched me in the face because I was wearing an A&M shirt, that would be discrimination by definition. Or if they told me I couldn't, buy a drink at a bar because of my A&M shirt, that is discrimination. But we also have this third component, this cognitive component of stereotypes. And as we'll mention here, stereotype, I often think, imagine the law of least effort, right? We are going to use the least amount of effort to understand what we're talking about, to get an idea of what we're talking about. And stereotypes work a lot better. They're little pictures in our head, right? They can be positive or negative, right? We think of Asians as a model minority, for instance, right? We also think of how maybe white men can't jump versus black men can, or they're all good athletes. And really just think about the fact that with these cognitive stereotypes that we use, they're just quick judgments that are used to help us make rational arguments faster, right? And we know stereotyping is a generalization about a group in which certain traits are assigned to basically everyone, even if that's not true, regardless of that being true. So this is going to be our basics of what we're talking about today. And knowing attitudes, this helps us to understand what the different components of prejudice, discrimination, and stereotyping are. And I run into this issue a lot, and I think it's very much worth bringing up. Aren't stereotypes just schemas for people? Yeah. They really are. Think about the different type of stereotypes that we have for people in the United States. Where I lived in Texas, it used to be yes, sir, yes, ma'am, which was very true. Old peeps live down here in Florida. Also pretty true. Horses, etc., where I used to live back in Ohio. And, you know, really, what's so wrong with stereotyping? Well, I don't have any old people in my class, and you are all supposed to be, right, on a normal semester in class in Florida. So this old peeps, right, by our definition, is completely overgeneralized, right? That this is not going to be a truthful statement of the matter. Yes, there may be statistically more old people in Florida than in other states. That doesn't mean everyone's an old person. And when we overgeneralize stereotypes, we can run into certain issues where we believe that maybe everybody from Kazakhstan is like this American actor who pretended to be from Kazakhstan. They're often inaccurate. So I remember seeing a couple of these quotes that I've come across before, right? This man from Nigeria, or it could be a woman, says Americans can't complete a sentence without saying the F word or the S word. They all have guns, nice cars, many beautiful girlfriends, and lots of money. Certainly don't know what Americans you're talking about. And then this British person said that America, let's see, well, there's Hollywood, they're loudmouths, they eat lots of junk food. I mean, maybe it's true, but look, that's not everybody. And stereotypes are often resistant to change and used to justify unjust policy and practices or discrimination, right? Thinking things like drinking from a separate fountain just because there's more melanin in your skin, which is stupid. But the idea that we're really getting to, right, at the core of this, and that our country is currently dealing with, I would like to think, is this idea of racism. And racism is an individual's prejudicial attitudes and discriminatory behavior towards people of a given race. Now notice we're not talking about a cognitive component here, right? Racism is a prejudiced attitude, so that affective component, and then this discriminatory behavior, the behavioral component. What's interesting, though, is racism can also be institutional. And this is where a lot of people get confused, right? So what do we mean by this? Well, we know that it's not just what we think about people, but it's also how people are represented in locations that, right, maybe are more visible. For instance, this is an Aunt Jemima ad from back in town. Eyes in town, honey, is probably not how most African Americans speak, but to give her this kind of African American vernacular makes her seem, right, certain in a certain way, in terms of this, probably less intelligent than the people she's working for. Happy days here, time faux delicious, right? This is really messed up if you think about it. And we know this isn't just necessarily, in ads, but this happens to people all the time. I just realized I would say that the cognitive component of attitudes and specifically prejudice is available here because we often stereotype and suggest that racism is all of these, right, or that these racist thoughts that people have are also because everybody in that race is like this, has these same kind of thoughts, these stereotypes. But nonetheless, racism is not just at an individual, but also at an institutional level, and it can be seen, right, on things like TV, on the news, in movies, in our culture, and all of this does relate to this. Now, there's a lot of isms. It's not just racism. There's things like sexism, where this can be a discriminatory behavior between people of a given sex. Now, that doesn't just mean that sexism is towards women. There is sexism towards men. However, for the most part, it tends to be a lot less severe. Like, I always joke with people that, like, my biggest stereotyping that I'm probably ever going to get in my life is, like, if I take my daughter to the playground, people might think I'm weird if they don't realize I'm there with my daughter, right? They might think I'm a creep. But, like, short of that, being a white person does have its benefits. And talking about this in terms of hostile or benevolent sexism, for instance, we can also talk about hostile or benevolent other isms too. But hostile or benevolent sexism exists. So when we think about isms, we mostly think about hostile isms, right? Things that are bad and happening because of this. Hostile racism is basically just what racism is. But there's benevolent or positive versions of sexism too, right? And they seem good on the surface, but they're not, right? And so the idea is that hostile sexism is going to be this belief that, right, maybe a negative stereotype that women are inferior because they're less intelligent, smart, whatever somebody says, versus a benevolent sexism, which might say that, well, women are kinder, more empathetic, smarter, so they're probably going to be better at, caring for the children or caring for a family. That's still pretty sexist, saying that a man can't do those things. However, right, benevolent sexism is kind of nice. Maybe it's the reason a man holds the door open for a woman. But underneath that, is that because he thinks that the woman can't do it himself? Or is that something that's given any thought? Now, again, we can open the door for one another like normal people. Really, what I'm talking about here is, are you the kind of person who only holds the door open for women? In which case, that would be a very clear example of benevolent sexism. Now, you're less likely to get called out on it, but still an example of this. And what's interesting is institutional practices also, right, happen with sexism. There is institutionalized sexism. A fantastic example is the fact that women had to earn the right to vote, along with people who weren't white men and owned land. And so recognizing that these, it's not just these, but other isms too, right? We can talk about, where you're from. We can talk about age discrimination. We can talk about weight discrimination. This is great quiz online. Is this person a professor or a hobo? And it's a lot harder than you would imagine, actually. Turns out once you get your PhD and tenure, you can just start looking like a bum. Pretty smart of them. But I have a question, though. We talk about stereotypes and prejudice and these things, and we talk about what those individuals look like. What happens when we meet somebody who doesn't fit our stereotype? How do we handle this? So an example of this would be, because you have to use stereotypes. One of the examples I show up in a minute is somebody who's gay but plays professional sports. This is seen as something, right, probably less common in a stereotype of homosexuals or people who are on the LGBT spectrum rather than straight individuals. And how do we handle finding out information like this? So go ahead and give me a sentence or two about what do we do with stuff like that. So what do we do if we meet people who don't fit our stereotypes, right? For instance, if the stereotype is that Asians are intelligent, an athletic Asian person, a strong woman, a smart African American, God, who doesn't love Urkel, and then being gay in the NFL. Well, what do? Is we create subtypes. We create a category for exceptions. When we say that, right, for instance, all Asians are smart, but some of them are actually really athletic. And this is a way to keep our stereotypes and not expand our stereotypes to say, well, Asians can be fast, or they can be slow, or they can be unathletic or athletic, right? It's a way to say, but this one in particular, there's some in particular, right? And this is getting towards an idea of getting rid of stereotypes and recognizing there's all types of people, but it's still part of the problem. And recognizing that creating a category for exceptions doesn't necessarily mean that you are saying that everyone can have this exception, but there are some people who don't fit this. Now, there's also this idea of intersectionality. And intersectionality is very important. It is something that I think needs to be taught on a lot more. It's the idea that different aspects of who we are, different selves that we are, right, might combine to create unique models of discrimination, right? There is a difference between a straight white man who is disabled and maybe an African-American woman who is disabled, and how we treat these individuals. There's often differences in the, right, how would I say this? It's a good example. I'm going to pause the video and think of this. So I found a good picture, actually. So, for instance, let's take from The Office, Kevin. Kevin is a, let's say he's an overweight man, where, right, that we would say maybe sizeism is a factor for him, which isn't one of these, and then race. So when he is a white man who is large, right, that is considered pretty negative. But, right, here is an example of a, I guess, a Japanese person who would be large may be considered, right, that's not a problem. And all we did was change their race, right? And that's going to combine to create a unique mode of discrimination. It's often been said, and research has backed up the fact that African-American women are seen as more likely to be aggressive for standing up for themselves, and that is greater than the aggressive components of being a woman and standing up for yourself, or being an African-American and standing up for yourself. The combined nature of the two creates even more of this kind of type of discrimination. So understanding that your specific life factors in these domains and others all matter about what people see you as, and maybe might be likely to stereotype or hopefully not discriminate you. Then comes the question of, does all types of prejudice look the same? Well, no. And this isn't even necessarily between the isms, but there are two main types of prejudice in general. There's traditional prejudice, usually considered traditional racism, we'll say, right? And this is, right, prejudice against a racial group that is consciously acknowledged and openly expressed. So this is your typical, I hate X group people, right? This very overt and clear racism or sexism or whatever it might be. But we also have what is called modern prejudice. So in the example of modern racism, this is a prejudice against a racial group, so say a prejudice by a white person against African Americans, that exists along an explicit rejection of racist beliefs. So for instance, if a white man says, I am not racist at all, I love people of all colors, and I agree that we should have a more diverse workplace, but then, right, implicitly believes none of that, says, no, I think white people are the best. That's a type of racism that exists. And this is something that, right, I often wonder, can we really trust people to, right, not lie about certain things? Well, we can't trust people to not lie about everything, that's for sure, but people can very much hide their attitudes, as we said in Chapter 9. And this is much more subtle and socially acceptable form of racism, right? So maybe you are not going to specifically walk away from a table if you have to work with somebody of a different race, but maybe you'll sit far away from them. Maybe you'll be less likely to hire them if you're interviewing them. Maybe you're less likely to have positive interactions with them. And these are all examples of modern racism and modern prejudice in general. And as mentioned before, this applies to any form of prejudice. Excuse me. Now, my other VLQ for you is, what does this look like? And how do we spot modern racism versus traditional racism, for instance? So tell me, what does modern racism look like to you? And how is it that we can go about kind of seeing this and figuring out what to do with it? So with that in mind, I'll go ahead and pause the video, or you should too, and we will talk about it in class. So looking at a study with modern racism, this is called the Shoving Study by Duncan. And basically, this was a really cool study, and it shows the idea of modern racism pretty clearly in a pretty clean-cut way. So white participants would watch what they called an interaction that was pre-taped between two other Confederates. And these participants would get into a heated argument, and one would push the other. So these two Confederates would talk, get mad, and one would push the other. So there were two videos. Excuse me, never done that one before. So there were two videos. In the first video, an African-American Confederate shoved a white Confederate. And in the second video, a white Confederate shoved the African American Confederate. And then all they did was they asked people if the participants were aggressive. Now, in both conditions, somebody was aggressive. So we should expect approximately equal ratings of aggressiveness across the board. That is not what we find at all. Look at that. That's disgusting, if you ask me. That when the white person was shoving the African American, only 20, or not even 20, about 12 to 15%, 13% of raters said that the white person was aggressive by pushing the African American. Now, but when the African American person pushed the white person, 73% of raters said they were aggressive. And this was the same argument, the same type of push, right? Everything was the same. It's just the color of their skin. And we see a huge difference in this, suggesting that there are these biases that maybe we're not even aware of. I can be, as we've mentioned in class before, implicitly, right? I can have my IAT say I have an implicit bias towards white individuals, and I might express outwardly that I'm not prejudiced, but there still might be prejudiced thoughts going around my head through socialization, other things like this, but we'll talk about where that comes from in a little bit. Another study regarding modern racism looked at job applicants. And this one really makes me unhappy because you see some real differences that go back into this idea of institutional racism. And what you see is that white participants fill out a modern racism scale. These studies are mostly done on white individuals and looking at difference between white individuals and African Americans. And that's just a good way to do this because when we start looking at racial differences of prejudice between other races, it's a big old effect, and so it's best to stick with maybe a majority group looking at a minority group. However, if you're interested in modern racism that African Americans show to other races, by all means, that would be a fantastic study that you might be able to do. Right? You've got a paper right here that would be really good to look at if you're looking for something for your senior project. So let's talk about the two groups they split people into. Depending on where you fell on this modern racism scale, you fall into the high modern racist category, the low modern racism category. And then everybody was asked to sample some job applications. Half of them were white applicants, half of them were black applicants. And basically you were asked to give a rating between when they were excellent, terrible, or in between. So what happens here? Well, when the applicant is super bad or super good, right, the white and the black applicants were rated the same. Because, right, if you have somebody coming in here with the best degree and all the experience, you really can't turn them down no matter what race you are. Because, right, they are going to be the person who knows what's going on, knows what to do. Plus, modern racists might run into the issue where they would be seen as racist if they decided to not hire the person who was, right, really good, but not of the race that they like. But the issue comes in the in-betweens. When participants had an in-between applicant, right, somebody who had some good, had some bad, it might be better and easier to get away with modern racism. And so what you see is that people high in modern racism rate those white applicants with the same amount of in-between higher than the African-American applicants with the same amount of kind of in-between level of skills. So if they were like both a 5 out of 10, the white, a high, get this right, a person high in modern prejudice with a white applicant who's about middle of the score, say 5 out of 10, a white applicant who is, or a white reviewer who is high on this modern racism scale is going to put that person up for a job. Say, yeah, you're only a 5, but you're white, and I like that. But a person who's a 5, this applicant who's a 5 and is black, right, that's the only difference. They might not be put up for hire by this same person due to modern racism. And that's what we're getting at here, is the idea that this modern racism is almost able to be used as kind of a covert way to keep people out of scenarios. And this, in an instance, is a white on black version of modern racism. However, we can think of modern prejudice in any form, black on white, men on women, women on men, and we would likely find similar results. Now, moving on from there, another study to talk about is this cubicle emergency study. Again, looking at white participants. So the white participants entered the lab and were told they'd be interacting one-on-one or with a group. They were also told that one of the Confederates was either white or black on the one-on-one condition. If there were more than 2 people in this study, at least one individual would be African American. And what they did was they seated these people in individual cubicles, and all of them spoke through intercoms. And what they saw was that when a Confederate declared that they were having an emergency, right, I'm not feeling well, can somebody please send help? When this person was an African American versus a white person, we see some profound differences. And I think this is a really cool study when you look at these findings, right? What do you see here? Well, we see that actually white individuals will leave to help an African American individual slightly more, not statistically more, than white individuals when we are talking about a one-on-one interaction, because there's nobody else there. You're kind of responsible for this person. But look at the difference between the group findings, right? That about 75% of people will show up to help out in a group if the person having the emergency is white, where we're talking a little over 1/3 if the person is African American. Again, suggesting that the amount of melanin in your skin is going to depend on whether some people are willing to help you or not. That's really sad, and I don't like giving this lecture. This lecture is a bummer, and I hate to give it, but I think it's a very important thing to talk about. And what we need to do is, I think, focus on where this comes from, because it's stupid. It's a big waste of time to be prejudiced, racist, sexist against other people. Where does prejudice come from? Well, actually, I'm going to save some of the reasons or some of the things that prejudice comes from, some of the places prejudice comes from for class. I'm going to skip over a couple and talk about them in more detail in class. But some of the ones I will talk about are things like realistic conflict theory, which I find to be incredibly useful when talking about coronavirus. Realistic conflict theory is this idea that limited resources lead to conflict between groups and, as a result, increase prejudice and discrimination. So, when there are problems, when we are unable to get what we need, then we see that this becomes a huge problem, right? This is strongest among groups that stand to lose most if a group succeeds. So, for instance, right? For instance, we see that during the kind of civil rights movement, there was high anti-black prejudice among the white working class because they were ones who stood to lose their own, lose their jobs to African Americans and be threatened by that. And so there is this idea that based on our kind of resources, whether that be territory, power, things we need, food, money, that this might cause some intergroup conflict. Another thing we see that's pretty interesting, and not necessarily a good way, maybe morbidly interesting is a good way to put it, is this idea of ethnocentrism, where we glorify one's own group while vilifying another. The interesting thing, though, is it's not always focused on ethnicity, though it can be. The kind of idea behind ethnocentrism is that when the going gets tough, we rely on our groups and more or less circle the wagons, right? And the idea behind circling the wagons back in the day was to create kind of a barrier between you and the other people. And what we see is that after 9/11, prejudice towards African Americans was reduced in the U.S. Well, why? Where does that come from? Well, because African Americans were now seen as much closer to Americans than Muslim Americans, or, right, quote unquote, those from the Middle East. That idea is that we focus on who is part of our group, in this case, Americans. And there was a very strong pro-America and anti-non-American sentiment in the U.S. at that point. And we do see how that can affect us. And that can affect how groups in different races, in this case, are seen in their terms of their status, which is really crazy to think that something like that can make a change. Now, there's some other places where prejudice can come from as well, and one of them is through what we call social identity theory. So, for instance, at A&M, I don't really know much about Stetson yet, there were, they said howdy every time he started class. All of these were kind of A&M themed things, right? That parts of their identity as an Aggie, as you call them, right? This is part of your self-concept and feelings of self-esteem, right? These all come from who we are. And who we are comes from our personal identity and our group status. And we use our membership of groups to maintain positive self-views. We all like to think, right, that Stetson is a good school because we are, it's in our benefit to go to a good school. You wouldn't choose a school that's bad on purpose, right? So what we do is we look at all the good things that Stetson has done and we use it in place of as kind of a way to make ourselves feel good. And we can call this basking in reflected glory, or BIRG. So we often take pride in the accomplishments of other people from our group. And you might think, really? Well, think about the Olympics. Think about when your team wins a sporting event. All of these things help us to take pride in our group, right? Even though we're not doing them. When your football team or whatever team you follow in sports wins, we won, right? Our team won, my team won. You are almost taking credit for something that you had no real job in doing. And in this has its own kind of issues, but generally we want to be part of the best group. And when our groups are good, we tend to like that more. Now, not only this, but we also, in terms of stereotyping, or I should say, cognitively stereotyping people, we often do what's called the outgroup homogeneity effect. So outgroups become homogeneous or very similar. We believe that outgroup members are more similar in terms of their actions and how they look than our in-groups, right? We all look alike, or they all look alike, but we're all diverse. So what's interesting, though, is how people look at this, right? In a homogeneous group, right, this homogeneity effect, everybody is the same. But in fact, if we think about society, right, there's all kinds of different people, and these are just their jobs. I mean, or I guess maybe they're not all their jobs, but the idea behind this is that, right, it's easier and quicker and mentally much, much more beneficial to just quickly be like, yeah, that, right, all people from, we'll get to that example in a second. But there's also this idea of the own race identification bias. This tendency for people to be better able to recognize and distinguish faces from their own race than other races. So very much a stereotype that people have, but this is also rooted in the way that we are raised, actually. So human babies are able to tell the differences between monkey faces at about up to a year old. But then they start to specify and focus in on their kind of faces or types of faces around them. So for instance, a kid growing up where I grew up in a very, very homogeneous place, very white place in the country, they're not going to be as well trained to spot the differences between other types of faces based on other races. Now, if you grow up in a very diverse environment, you're probably going to have a better ability to avoid this own race identification bias. And we know from studies on biracial individuals, right, this own race identification bias is actually both race identification biases, which is very interesting. But going back to that outgroup homogeneity effect for a second, think about what a French person looks like and describe what they look like to me. Go ahead and take a minute for that, and let's talk about that afterwards. Okay, so how many of you drew a picture or thought of somebody like this? If you did, you were a lot like me, right? You're making a very quick stereotype. These are all French people, right? And when we talk about this outgroup homogeneity effect, is it really fair to say that all French people are like this guy? No, right? Just like not all Americans wear cowboy hats and cowboy boots every day. So the idea is this is a cognitive stereotype that makes us very quick to think about these things. And with the own race identification bias, we talked a bit about why this exists, probably mostly due to socialization, but I would also argue that At least for me, all four of these people also look the same. So where does prejudice come from? You know, we can talk about the outgroup homogeneity effect. We can talk about realistic group conflict, a lot of other things. But one other one that I'd like to talk about is this dissociation model of prejudice, which is a two-step model. First is the idea that stereotypes are automatically triggered. They're heuristics. They're quick automatic thinking. But then we control whether or not we decide to accept that stereotype. And this might help us determine whether we act on a stereotype or not. But other things like being distracted or overwhelmed or having our ego depleted might cause us to not actually be able to not control for that stereotype. So for instance, if the stereotype is triggered and we go through an automatic processing route, right, we are going to go and see prejudice happen. But if stereotyping is triggered and then we use a controlled processing route and recognize that we should we should not accept this stereotype, you can decrease your prejudice. So where does prejudice come from? Probably partially from automatic stereotyping, just because it's quicker and easier to do. But what are the consequences of this? Pretty bad. But we can avoid this through practice, through trying to make a conscious effort to avoid these things. And we can see benefits from this. So what are the consequences of prejudice? Well, firstly, one of the most interesting ones is this idea that self-fulfilling prophecies come back in. So in an interview study, and this study can be a bit hard to explain, so I am going to try to break this down as best as possible. But if you do have questions, please let me know. The Word et al. Study with interviews. So this has white participants interviewing Confederates for a job. So these Confederates were black or white and posing as job applicants. What they found was that white participants tended to treat black applicants or black Confederates worse than white Confederates. And so what was so cool about this is they actually went ahead and based their training for the next group of people on how they treated these different individuals. So this next step, they brought in new white interviewers to interview white participants and only white participants. So where in the step one, we were looking at white on white and white on black, in step two, we are only looking at white on white interviews. So what they did was they trained these people to interview in one of two styles. The way that in part one, white people interviewed other white people. So this better way to treat people. Or they trained them to interview people in the way that white participants treated the African American individuals in this worse kind of interview style. And now they did these new ratings with some part two interviews. And what you see is that interviewees in the white-black style were less adequate and less friendly in terms of their ratings. So another way to look at this, in part one, white participants interviewed black and white Confederates. White participants tended to treat black interviewees worse than whites in a couple different ways. They tended to sit further back, they ended interviews quicker, and they performed more modern racist behaviors, right? Saying explicitly that they're not being racist, but maybe less likely to hire or treating people with less respect. Now in part two, we trained new white interviewers in a couple different ways. This white and white interview style, or this white versus black interview style. And both of these were similar to what happened naturally here. So we are trying to recreate what naturally happened in part one. And in part three, these new white interviewers trained in part two rated all white participants. So white interviewees who interviewed in the white-black style were rated as less effective. They were rated more like African American employees in step one. Why do I spend so much time explaining this? Because this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe that this African American isn't going to be worth your time as a white person interviewing them, you are going to end the interview earlier. You're going to be more modernly racist. You're going to try to care. You're not going to care as much. And when we train people to do that, we see this happens to white people too. And so what does this say? Well, that self-fulfilling prophecies do happen. If you are somebody who is modern or traditionally racist, you are maybe more likely to act racist towards this person, or treat them, not give them as much of the benefit of the doubt. and that if you did that to a white person, we would find the same thing. And then it's not necessarily the idea that the African Americans are interviewing worse, but it's the idea that the white interviewers are interviewing the African Americans not the same as their partners. Excuse me, I have a very angry dog. Finally, let's talk about how we can reduce prejudice. One thing we can think of is the contact hypothesis, that if we just have individuals contact one another through positive means, that this is going to lead to better group interactions. Excuse that slide. So we're going to talk about the contact hypothesis, right? This idea that the contact between members of different groups leads to more positive intergroup attitudes. So for instance, we want to see these positive interactions between race. If we want to reduce these tensions is one way to do this. However, it's not just this, right? There might be some issues with the contact hypothesis. For instance, you want to make sure that these contacts are good, and you don't want these contacts to necessarily be any kind of negative. But with this, right, we see that these contacts have to be, right, a little bit more than this. Thinking about Ruby Bridges, who was put into an all-white school as one of the kind of leaders of the segregation movement. Well, she became a leader. She was very young at the time. But the contact has to have some special components, right? There must be equal status among the members. Both the white and African-American children should, in this case, be considered equal. Whether or not that happened at the beginning, right, that's to be determined. There's this idea of common, or what we call superordinate goals, right, where we want to have these kind of work together as a community. This probably also explains a little bit about that African Americans being considered more American after 9/11, right? The reason being is that we came together as a country, that everybody was part of that. There's support from a legitimate authority. So if the teacher, in the case of Ruby Bridges, or right, the government is the one saying, hey, we should do this, that is going to be considered more powerful than if the government was going against this. And for instance, U.S. Marshals had to be brought in to help Ruby Bridges go to school because the governor, I believe, of the state was not pro-segregation, and recognizing that probably made it more difficult for this this kind of contact hypothesis to work. The last thing I'd like to mention here regarding this is this idea of a jigsaw classroom. And jigsaw classroom is a really cool concept where we just really make everyone responsible for parts of learning. So we divide students into diverse groups, and we make each student responsible for learning a unique portion of the material. So imagine I split this chapter up into 5, and I had different 5-person groups, and I said, each of you is responsible for learning 1/5 of this chapter, and then teaching that material to the other group members. Well, what happens afterwards? We see more positive attitudes towards in-group and out-group members. We see better academic performance and increased self-esteem, even greater empathy among these people. So recognizing that the jigsaw classroom is one really effective way to help to kind of break the ice almost in terms of these situations, and is a really useful thing. However, in a class like this, maybe it's not good to use the jigsaw classroom just because coronavirus has caused a lot of problems. Now, the last thing I really want to talk about is this idea of changing social norms, right? How do we do this? Well, we should call out inappropriate behavior. We should avoid the bystander effect, which hopefully we know what that is by now, and using our normative social influence to send a message about what's okay and what's not. And for instance, this is now a couple years old, but it's a point I really like to make. It's our last VLQ, right? So there was, this came up on my feed about 1.5 years ago, and I've kept it in since. These Mississippi students posed in front of an Emmett Till memorial, and Emmett Till was, I believe, a 14-year-old boy who was killed by Klansmen. They held their guns in front of an Emmett Till memorial that had been shot up. I don't know how well you can see a couple of the bullet holes here, with some big old smiles on their faces. Now, Ole Miss stopped short of suspending the students, but they suspended them from the frat. And my question to you is, what are ways that we can change social norms to reduce prejudice in everyday life? Be specific. You don't repeat what I wrote, but this is, to me, a huge problem. And if you don't see it as a huge problem, I wonder if we're watching the same lecture. But, right, what is it that we can do to stop things like this? And with that, let's go ahead and throw on our announcements, office hours. Make sure you're watching what you need to be doing with the syllabus. And if you have any questions, shoot me an email. All right, everybody. This lecture, we're going to supplement a lot of what I actually skipped over from this video in class. So if you do have questions on the stuff that we did go over, please let me know at the beginning of class so we can clear that up. Then we'll spend some time talking about some other stuff. So with that in mind, have a great day, and I will see you all during class. Have a good one.